So, Lone Rider here, and I wanted to throw something out there related to mountain biking. This is something that came up uh, earlier this spring when a bunch of local cyclists um, decided to revisit the issue of mountain bike access in Union County, New Jersey. Now, to briefly recap, over 20 years ago, a bunch of unelected government employees got together behind closed doors in a backroom meeting in Union County and decided to ban mountain biking there. And they created a ban just about Watchung. So no mountain biking at Watchung Park. Now, they did this by basically just getting together behind closed doors and deciding it on themselves. There was no vote, there was no law or ordinance passed, anything like that. At some point later on, they began pretending that there was an old ordinance that they were just resuming enforcement of. This was an ordinance from 1983 about roads, sidewalks, paths, and not blocking cars. Not only does it not say anything about mountain biking by name as a keyword or off-road cycling generally, under whatever terminology, it doesn't even talk about the trails in the park. The ordinance doesn't contain the word trail. And the first time this ordinance was linked specifically in writing, they had been talking about some old ordinance, but nobody ever knew what kind. The first time this ordinance was actually linked in writing to the 1995 decision to ban mountain biking, which was created in a backroom meeting, was in like 2015 or 2014 when I started filing Open Record Act requests to try and get to the bottom of this. So, it's kind of sketchy, the whole history of this thing. And then, of course, at that time and ever since, they've been talking about concerns about trail damage and injury, but they never documented at the time, in the 1990s, a single incidence of trail damage, user conflict, or injury. If mountain biking was so bad that there was no way to have any kind of a compromise, the mountain bikers just had to be, banned from the park. One, why didn't they actually make the case to the elected body, the freeholders, and have a law or ordinance passed? Why did they do it in secret if it was such a good idea? And secondly, where was the documentation of all these problems? If there was such widespread havoc being wreaked, how come nobody ever bothered to document a single instance of it? In fact, the Union County government held on to various things about mountain biking that weren't related to Watchung at all. They had several newspaper articles about mountain biking conflicts at other parks from the popular press. One was as far away as Stamford, Connecticut. None of them were about Watchung. They had a trail study, but it was done of two trails in another park in another county. The study itself is kind of questionable, but beyond that, it wasn't finished until after the decision to ban mountain biking in 1995. In fact, it's stamped right on the cover, received Union County Parks Department, April 1996. So the decision to ban us was made in March of 1995. That's almost a year later. My question, I guess, would be, how stupid do they think citizens are? When you ask somebody for the source material they relied on to make a decision that was made at a particular time, and they send you stuff that's either not about the subject or twice as bad, not about the subject and didn't even exist or wasn't in hand until a year later. Crazy. I mean, the fact that they relied on a trail, leaving aside the fact that they didn't have this in hand at the time, so they couldn't have relied on it to make a decision. It wasn't about Watchung. It was about two trails in another park in another county. So I guess my question would be, if there was, havoc and destruction being wreaked in Watchung on a daily basis by mountain biking, why didn't they reference that? Why did they have to reference a study from another park in another county that they didn't even have in hand until a year after they made the decision to ban us? It not only wasn't something they could have relied on because they didn't have it at the time, it's something that wasn't even about Watchung. But they bothered to hold on to this and to these newspaper reports for 20 years. The only thing they had that was actually about Watchung was a handful, literally 3, anonymous hand-scribbled complaints that were filled out at uh, like a suggestion box at the Trailside Center. And they said things like, too many bikers are annoying the hikers. Now, if you ask the bikers, they might have said there were too many hikers being annoying to them. It wouldn't be a reason to ban hiking. But more to the point, we don't know who wrote this. We don't know who the hikers were. We don't know who the bikers were. We don't know what anybody specifically did beyond being perceived as annoying or bothersome, which is so subjective as to be completely meaningless. So if you wanted to talk about a documentation of trail user conflict, this isn't actual documentation because we don't know which party was which. We don't know who it was, who the hikers were, who the bikers were, what anybody in particular was doing or not doing. All we know is that somebody thought somebody else was a meanie or rude. Well, you know what? I could think somebody's rude if they're doing something that's perfectly safe and normal and they have every right to do, just because my expectations are skewed, and vice versa. I mean, we know from the effort to get mountain bike access that, well, the mountain bike opponents talked a lot about safety and trail damage and saving Mother Earth. A lot of what they were really worried about was they just didn't want to have to see somebody on a bike because that didn't fit their idea of the park aesthetic. So the cyclists could have been annoying the hikers by simply doing nothing wrong and simply being there, right? I mean, we know to this day there's a lot of people who oppose mountain biking. They just don't want to have to see the bikers, and some of them flat out said so. Some of them went so far as to say they didn't not only not want to have to see the bikers on the trail when they went into the woods to hike. Some of the people who lived near the park were annoyed that they'd be able to look out their back window through the trees and see people on bikes. You bought a house near a public park. I mean, are you bothered by all the people hiking or riding horses? But yeah, so since annoyance and being bothered by something is so subjective, we can't, and we don't know the names of the people involved or anything. They're anonymous, they're hand scribbled, their handwriting's even worse than mine, and mine is bad. So these aren't documentation of anything because nothing was documented. No names, no location, no specific actions. All we know is that somebody basically said they thought somebody else was bothering them, which means what exactly? Nothing. So except for those 3 anonymous hand-scribbled complaints about allegedly rude or whatever bikers, there was nothing about Watchung in this pile of documents. But they held on to them for over 20 years. So don't you think that if there was something about the conditions at Watchung specifically, about actual trail damage, an actual documented case of user conflict, where we know the names of the people involved, and more importantly, who did what, where we know, for example, that a given person was injured by a given action, anything like that, don't you think that they would have held on to that too? I would think so. Now, we know that the government went out of its way, and the mountain bike opponents went out of its way during the, between 2014 and 2016, 17, when there was an effort to get mountain bike access, which had been promised. The government had, when we finally came out with all this stuff, the government was like, look, we'll work with you. You'll get some park access. And then they dragged the thing out for 3 years. Now, in the meantime, the consultant that they hired, as CME Associates, got paid a lot of money. People got nothing. There were no trails open to bikers. No other ones were built, etc. Nothing. For a brief period of time, the no bike signs were taken down, but then the following spring, they were replaced by new ones that they had printed. And those new ones weren't just put where the signs were before. They were put at all the county parks that were never closed before. Because for 20 years, this ban was just about riding at Watchung. I don't know why they decided to close all the other county parks, whether it was out of spite. You're trying to get access at Watchung. We'll show you. We'll close all the parks. You won't just get access at Watchung. You'll lose access everywhere else. Maybe it was the government just kind of flexing its muscles and being a bully. It might have been something as simple as, even though the decision to ban mountain biking was created in a backroom meeting, if they were going to try and pretend going forward that it had any legislative legitimacy, well, something based on an actual law or ordinance would have to apply countywide to all county parks, unless otherwise stated in the law or ordinance. So if they were going to try to pretend that this ordinance from 1983 about roads, sidewalks, paths, and not blocking cars was actually about mountain biking or biking on the trails in the park, they would have to apply it countywide. So I don't know. But for whatever reason, they closed all the parks, and these were all new trail closures. From 1995 until like 2016, the ban was only ever about Watchung. It was created for Watchung. It was only ever about Watchung. And then 20 years later, they just, I guess, had an epiphany, like Archimedes coming up out of his bath and said, oh gosh, this was really supposed to be about all the county parks all along. Yeah, if you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn, bub. But, you know, for whatever, whether it's because they were being spiteful jerks or whether it's because they were trying to make it seem like this was based on some actual legislation, they arbitrarily expanded the ban 20 years after its inception to all the other county parks, effectively creating new trail closures when they posted these new signs saying no bikes on a trail. And point in fact, the signs don't actually talk about the word trail one way or the other. They have a picture of a bicycle, and it's worth noting that they used a picture of a road bicycle with drop bars. But they have a picture of a bicycle with a circle with a slash through it, and that's all they have. They don't say no bikes on trails. They don't say no bikes in the woods. They just have that. And then at the bottom, they reference this old ordinance. But if you actually go and read the ordinance, it's about roads, sidewalks, paths, and not blocking cars. And among some of the emails that they tried to hide from the Open Record Act request, and I ultimately had to sue them to get access to, they were basically admitting amongst themselves that these signs are confusing to people. A lot of people go and read the ordinance that's referenced on the bottom and walk away thinking they can't ride on the road or the path. And so we have people who are not riding on the paved paths where they're actually allowed to ride under county policy, because the county policy is only about no mountain biking on the dirt trails. But the signs that they put up to enforce that policy reference, again, an ordinance that's only about roads, sidewalks, paths, and not blocking cars. So anybody who reads it literally is going to be like, well, it says I can't ride on the path. What do I do? They proposed, now they never went through with this, but they proposed in these emails amongst themselves creating a second set of signs that said you can ride on the path but not the trails. Now think about the logic here, or illogic. They want to ban mountain biking. They post signs saying no bikes with a picture of a crossed off road bike, and then underneath reference an ordinance number that refers to an ordinance that's only about roads, sidewalks, paths, and not blocking cars. Doesn't say anything about trails. The signs themselves say nothing about trails or mountain biking. And even if you want to nitpick, the picture of the bike they use isn't even a mountain bike. It's clearly a road bike with curved drop handlebars. Now, by itself, singling out what picture they used for the bike, it could be a BMX bike, a beach cruiser, an old 3-speed, or a mountain bike. And by itself, it wouldn't matter if the signs were clear in any other way. But it's kind of like, so I'm not saying that just because they used a picture of a road bike doesn't mean you could ride a bike with other kind of handlebars. Their policy is clearly no bikes on the trail. But the point is that they didn't put anything saying no mountain biking on the signs. They didn't say no bikes in the woods, no bikes on the trail. They only put a picture of a crossed off road bike. And then they have a picture of the ordinance number underneath. That's literally all the signs say. And then if you, they have a reference also to ATVs, which I guess somebody could infer to also mean the trails. I don't know why they lump bikes and ATVs together. Maybe they're trying to make it seem like we're as destructive as ATVs, even though a bike weighs a hell of a lot less, doesn't have the torque, the wheelbase, etc. I don't know. But of course, it is ironic. Mountain bikes and ATVs are lumped together, but then the police are patrolling on ATVs, which are certainly more destructive than mountain bikes. And when they do the deer hunt every year, people come in on ATVs and tear it up. I don't have anything against hunting, but at least they should recognize, I guess, the hypocrisy of allowing ATV use, even if it's seasonal, and totally forbidding mountain bike use ever. It's kind of weird. But the point is, they created these signs that say, have a crossed off road bike, and then reference an ordinance that's about roads, sidewalks, paths, and not blocking cars. None of this, anything on the sign that's about bicycles. I mean, there's the ATV picture, but none of the things that's about bicycles on these signs say anything about riding on the trails, riding in the woods, mountain biking, etc. So then the government's wondering why the hell people are confused. Well, gee, what do you think, McFly? Now, here's the funny part. Their solution isn't to be like, well, I guess this ordinance really wasn't about mountain biking then. I mean, if the average man in the street with no preconceived bias is reading the sign and then going and reading the ordinance that it references and walking away thinking that it's about road, sidewalks, and paths, because that's what it says, I guess the government should, well, if a regular reasonable person can read this and that's what they think, then, but no, the government's response instead was to try and clarify the confusing situation they've created with their extra-legal backroom ban and repurposing some old ordinance about something else, and then drawing up these really poorly worded signs. And I wonder if they deliberately left everything about mountain biking off the signs, even including the picture, because they were trying to be ambiguous, so nobody would call them out and say, well, the ordinance doesn't actually talk about that, or if they were just sloppy and who knows. I mean, I guess you can't expect, a lot of intellectual, deep thinking and analysis about what they're going to put on these signs, since the whole point is to basically support a policy that was made in a back room with no documentation of the problem it was trying to address, allegedly, and no public input or even knowledge that it was happening at the time. But what is kind of funny is their response wasn't, well, maybe we're wrong. Their response was to say, let's make a second batch of signs to say that I know the first batch of signs we created show a road bike and talk about an ordinance that talks about roads, paths, sidewalks, and not blocking cars, but actually it's about the trails. So they create this first sign and they reference this ordinance that's not about mountain biking, but it's clearly intended to be. But people don't get it. So their response is to say, let's make a second batch of signs that contradict the first, but get across what we're trying to say by saying, well, actually you can ride on the paths, even though the ordinance that's cited on the first sign says you can't, but you can't ride on the trails, even though the ordinance that's cited on the sign doesn't mention trails one way or the other. And I guess it's no surprise that I had to sue them to get access to that, amongst other emails, because it really does kind of make them look stupid. This isn't me saying this. This is them saying amongst themselves, the county government employees, that the signs they created and the ordinance they're trying to use to justify this arbitrary ban are confusing people, because people read them, and when they actually go and look at the ordinance, it's clearly not about what they say it's about. And I'm not the one saying that. I am, but I'm saying that because that's what they said, that the average person who looks at the signs is walking away thinking. So it's like, okay, kind of ridiculous. But the ridiculousness was compounded. One of the other things I had to sue them to get, of course, was the emails where they were, one of the things that they put on little flyers that they distributed throughout the park. Let me see, do I have them here? I had them at one point. Did I get rid of them? I don't know. Anyway, there were these flyers they distributed on little kiosks throughout the park, and the flyers at the bottom threatened to confiscate or impound people's bikes if they were operated on the trails in the park. Well, the ordinance that they say forbids mountain biking doesn't prescribe confiscation of your property as a penalty. Even if it was about mountain biking, which it's not, the penalty is like a small fine, like $20 or something. There's another ordinance in there that's just as old, archaic, Deadwood. There's something about your bike being registered with your town, which nobody enforces anymore. Basically, if the police stop you and the bike isn't registered and they therefore think it's stolen, they can then confiscate it. The problem is, since registering your bike with the government is not a thing that's part of modern cycling, some towns might still do it if you ask them, but it's certainly not enforced. And the vast majority of, I think I know like one cyclist who actually tried to register their bike, and the only reason he did it was specifically to basically, say, ha ha, I found your loophole to the Union County people, so that they wouldn't threaten to confiscate it. But basically, the threat to confiscate the bike was based on this separate ordinance about registering your bike, which since nobody does anymore, it's archaic deadwood. And you can't make the leap. It wasn't just that the bike wasn't registered. It was that if the bike wasn't registered and they therefore thought it was stolen. Now, if registering your bike was something that everybody did and you had to do it before you were allowed to take the bike out of the shop, etc., then yes, having an unregistered bike would be clearly seen as an indication that the bike might be stolen. But since nobody registers their bikes anymore, or hardly nobody, and literally nobody enforces this, not having a registered bike is actually normal. In other words, if it was abnormal to have an unregistered bike and registering your bike was a thing nowadays, I could see that being seen as an indication of a stolen bike. They can't confiscate the bike just because it's not registered. It has to be not registered, and they have to have a reason to think that that is an indication that it's stolen. But since the vast majority of bikes that anybody's going to see on any given day aren't registered, that not having a registered bike is normal. It's not abnormal. So it can't be seen as a sign of the bike might be stolen. I mean, they might as well, wearing purple feathers in your helmet as you ride down the road isn't a normal part of cycling either. So they can't stop you and say, hey, you don't have purple feathers on your helmet, your bike must be stolen. Because that's not a normal part of cycling. But more importantly, is that this is a separate ordinance. It has nothing to do with the ordinance they say bans mountain biking, whether it does or not. So the threat that they put on these flyers that were disseminated throughout the parks to confiscate your bike was essentially an illegal threat. This isn't enforcement of the law. It's, depending on the value of your bike, grand larceny. And the funny part is the government admitted that. In the same batch of emails that I had to sue to get, you have somebody from the county police department telling the other county people as they're debating what to put on the signs and flyers that they were going to throw up everywhere. You have somebody from the county police department telling them that it's misleading to put this on the signs and stuff because we cannot confiscate the bike just for operating it in the park. Wow. Now, my court costs when I sued them were, like $4,000 or $5,000. They eventually settled and then disclosed the information. Why were they willing to even try and fight it and spend all that money? Well, first of all, if my lawyer was charging me that much, their lawyer had to be charging them at least as much. And then there's the court costs and everything. And since they settled and lost, basically conceded losing the case before it ever went to court, they had to pay not only their lawyer, but also my lawyer. So we'd be looking at least like 10 grand here, plus the court fees and all the other stuff. My question is, why were they willing to spend so much money to hide a handful of emails? Well, the emails show them, one, admitting that the ordinance they reference on the signs that they say is about mountain biking really isn't, and they're so concerned about that, they want to create a second batch of signs as addendums to the first. And secondly, it shows that the threat that they knowingly published on these flyers and other things to confiscate people's property was a threat not authorized by law. That's not a legally authorized action according to the government themselves. And they talked about this amongst themselves, and they knew it. And they went ahead and they made that threat. They published that threat anyway. No wonder they were willing to pay a lot of money and engage in a lot of shenanigans to try and hide this crap. So that's the history of the Watchung mountain bike ban. Now, it came up after dragging their feet for 3 years, paying a consultant who was supposed to help come up with a new trail plan that included mountain biking access, a lot of money, including amending their contract to pay them specifically for the mountain biking stuff. But then after approving the thing on 2 occasions and approving specifically the funding and the contract change for it, the government then backpedaled, no pun intended, and canceled the mountain bike plan. But they never re-amended the contract. So the contractor walks away counting a long green. We walk away with, long faces because the people basically got screwed here. Well, about a year later, so earlier this spring, some of the cyclists that were involved in the earlier effort went to one of the freeholder, the county freeholder meetings here in Union County, New Jersey. And they raised the issue of, reconsidering it because that when they had canceled the mountain bike plan after approving it twice and approving the funding for it, the government people had basically said they'd be open to considering the idea, if anything changed in the future or if they could find another location within the county. Now here's the problem. The mountain bikers went to the meeting and they said, okay, so you said you were open to reconsidering this in the future. Let's talk about that. A handful of mountain bike opponents showed up and started, their usual, mountain bikers are evil and they're going to kill wildlife and they're all outlaws at heart. They're scumbags and all that stuff. One of the mountain bike opponents raised this issue, which was that what's changed since last year? Well, there was apparently a fatality. And he went on to talk about a mountain biker was apparently riding on a closed trail in another county. There's 2 counties in our area that don't allow mountain biking. You go to Somerset, it's allowed. You go to Morris, it's allowed. You go to basically almost every other county in the state of New Jersey and all state parks. But Union County and Essex County, which happen to be right next to each other, both have policies forbidding mountain biking. The difference is Essex County's policy is actually based apparently on an ordinance that says you can't ride where there's no paved surface. Now, this ordinance predates mountain biking by like 100 years. It was basically written to keep people on, high wheelers from running over kids at picnics. But the fact that it was never passed with the intent to outlaw mountain biking as an activity, because as a recreational activity, mountain biking didn't yet exist, is beside the point. Technically, the words in the law apply to what mountain biking is, namely riding where there's no paved surface. This is almost the exact opposite of Union County, where they reference an ordinance that's about paved surfaces, roads, sidewalks, paths, and not blocking cars. So, they both have archaic, stupid, backwards policies that you could say really have no legal justification. It's just that technically the wording of the ordinance they cite in Essex does apply to the activity of mountain biking, even though it was never intended to when it was enacted. But the point is nobody is allowed to ride there either. And so somebody was riding in Essex County and they fell and they died, apparently. And the mountain bike opponents brought this up as to say, well, see, this is proof that mountain biking is dangerous and shouldn't be allowed and blah, blah, blah. Now, with everything else about the questionable and sketchy history of the mountain bike ban in Union County, one of the things that stands out is that they never documented a single instance of trail user conflict or injury or anything else, that was documented prior to banning mountain biking in 1995. They never had any trail studies. They never had this, they never had that. Isn't that interesting? Why didn't they bring up actual cases of people who got hurt at Watchung? No, they brought up a case of somebody who got hurt in another county. Just like, when I asked them for what they relied upon years ago to conclude mountain biking had to be banned, they provided newspaper articles about parks in other counties and a trail study of a park in another county that didn't yet exist at the time they decided to ban us. So once again, nothing but evidence, but no evidence about Watchung. No evidence about Union County parks. So some guy in Essex County fell and got killed. It's tragic. As another biker, I feel for this guy and his family. But you know what? It doesn't justify a ban on mountain biking. Why? Well, does it really prove that mountain biking is dangerous? No. All it suggests is that mountain biking in an area where the trails aren't maintained, and aren't maintained in particular for mountain biking, along with other activities, is more dangerous than mountain biking at a place where it's intended that you have mountain bike access and the trails are maintained in a better fashion. The park where this guy crashed and got hurt and died is a park that basically the trails are known to be eyesores. They're falling apart. They're old. The joke is that it's legal to dump a body there, but not to mountain bike. If you drive the body in a car, it's literally become a place where some people don't want to go because there's bad people hanging out there doing drugs and things. And like I said, there's been rumors of body dumps and stuff. And maybe that bad stuff would still go on anyway. But the point is, if a lot of the people who would be using the park, mountain bikers, are discouraged from using it by government policy, then a lot of the areas become decrepit. You lose a lot of your trail volunteers, and frankly, the park is, like much of Watchung, not maintained. Watchung is a big park. There's people who took exception when I pointed out at public meetings going back to 2014 that the trails are like something out of a post-apocalyptic disaster film. Everybody got up and started booing me. And I was like, well, what do you mean? Have you ridden on these trails? Have you walked on these trails? Now, they were insisting that the trails were perfect and pristine. They were talking about trails in another part of the park. See, the park is so big that the conditions vary from part to part. Over by the Trailside Visitor Center, the trails are well maintained and they have a brand new bridges and everything. In the other part of the park, completely opposite direction, where I was riding and where a lot of the other people were riding, the trails were eyesores. And it wasn't because the bikes wrecked them. It was because they weren't maintained. There was water damage. Trails were washed out. Stuff was eroded and crumbling. There were soggy morasses. There were down trees that were just everywhere and nobody was picking them up. There were bridges that had collapsed into gullies and been washed downstream and nobody had ever replaced them. There was this one bridge where it was like one rotting beam and you had to throw your bike on your shoulder and go like this. And, I don't know, even without a bike, if somebody's just hiking, I don't know how they would cross all that safely. That seems to me to be not, a bridge that consists of one rotting, sagging beam is, as far as I'm concerned, poorly maintained. So, but they were looking at another part of the park. Anyway, a lot of these parks, when they exist only for the use of a handful of, people, such as like the 5 people that live nearby and walk their dogs there without leashes, by the way. Unlike the law about mountain biking, the law about dogs being on a leash is very clear. There's no question that your dog is required to be on a leash. I love dogs, don't get me wrong, but it's a sharp animal with teeth and claws, and nobody wants to get bitten in the nads. You also don't want the dog to get hurt if it runs off and whatever. And the only time I've ever seen anybody walking their dog on a leash there is when they're out near the road at the edge of the woods. If they're down the trails, nobody's dog is on a leash. But unlike the thing about mountain biking, where it's like they say there's an ordinance, but they also say that nobody who reads the ordinance can comes to the conclusion that it's about mountain, because it's so unclear and vague and doesn't really apply to what they're trying to apply it to. You read the ordinance about dogs being on a leash, it's very clear. But nobody has a problem with that. They have a problem with mountain biking. Maybe that's why they have a problem with mountain biking. Maybe they want to be able to walk their dogs off the leash, whatever. The point is that a lot of these parks certain sections have deteriorated. And parks where you have a lot of mountain bikers, you have a lot more use, but you also have a lot more people working to maintain the parks. And you have a lot more reason to maintain the parks because you have a lot of use. If you've got 5 people who walk in the park, they're going to stay in whatever area they normally walk in, and you don't have to really maintain the rest of the park, or not to as high a degree. If you have a higher amount of usage, you're going to have to fix all the broken bridges and this, that, and the next thing, because it's more of an issue. They brought up this guy who fell and died, and it's tragic. And as another biker, I'm sorry that somebody died. But the point is, he didn't fall and die because he was mountain biking. He fell and died essentially because he was mountain biking on an unauthorized trail that was poorly maintained, because the government has decided, I guess, that it's better to ban mountain bikers than to actually maintain their trails in a state which are usable for all. I don't know what they're doing with the difference in money. If they're not spending it on trail maintenance, is it going into somebody's pocket? Is it? I have no idea. This is Jersey. It could be going anywhere. But the point is that if they were to bringing up an example where a person died mountain biking in a county where there is no allowed mountain biking, doesn't prove that allowing mountain biking is dangerous. It proves that maybe that trails that aren't maintained for mountain biking are dangerous, that trails that just aren't maintained, period, are dangerous, that, not allowing some access to mountain biking is dangerous, because, people are still going to want to do it. And if they have no place that's designed for the activity, they're going to have to find another place, even if it's a section of dilapidated trails in a park that's more common for body dumps than for pleasant Sunday morning rides. So, I'm looking at it and I'm like, this is their logic. They brought up an example of somebody who got hurt mountain biking in a county where mountain biking was banned and the trails are poorly maintained. And then they're trying to say, well, that's not a reason. That's a reason not to allow mountain biking. No, actually, it's a reason to allow mountain biking. I guarantee you